In a recent video that I released on using colored backgrounds in macro photography using an old repurposed digital picture frame, I made a comment stating that white background macro photography was about as challenging as it gets. As a result of that comment, I received a barrage of two furious emails. Well, one of them was furious, the other one was actually talking about something else, but the furious one reads as follows. Dear Allan, love the videos. Why is white background macro photography so challenging? Thanks in advance. Yours sincerely, John. Well, frankly, I'm not used to this type of aggressive confrontation, and I didn't quite know how to respond. So I'm going to do what I always do when I don't know how to respond. I'm going to make a video. And this is it. So here's what we're going to do. I am going to define for you what a white background macro photograph is. And I'm going to talk about the specific challenges that make getting these photographs such a challenge. Then I'm going to walk you through the actual process of setting up the shot. I'm going to do so in my macro cage, but what I'm going to show you can go for whatever setup you have. Then I am going to take you into the computer and we're going to take a look at what you can do to perfect imperfect white background shots, both in Lightroom and in Photoshop. But before we get started, I have been a little remiss about thanking those generous Patreon supporters and contributors through my website, which is something that I always remember to do as I'm editing the video. So let me thank out loud Richard, Jay, Jim, Ken, Richard, and Allison, who have all joined Patreon in the last couple of months. And a huge thank you also to Colin, PH, Laura, and Karen, who have made generous contributions through my website on the donations page. I also have one very special shout out to Juan Carlos from Chile, who has both contributed through Patreon and also made a donation on the website. This is a trend I would like to see increase. Thank you, Juan Carlos. Your help is much appreciated, and that goes for everybody. Thank you so much. You make all this stuff possible. So let's get started. So what do I mean when I say white background macro photography? What I am not saying is whitish background or light background. When I say white background, I mean white, 255 in the red, green, and blue channel, pure white. And the reason that is so important is a lot of the image sharing and image hosting websites will have white backgrounds. And when you post a white background photograph, you should see no transition from the page to the photograph. If your background is light or whitish, it will look gray against a white background. This is a bit of an overcooked example, but I've taken a whitish background photograph and I put it on a canvas of pure white, and you can see exactly what I'm talking about. So for that reason, and not knowing necessarily where my photographs might end up, when I do a white background macro photograph, I make sure that my background is pure white, and I recommend that you do the same. So where do the challenges come in? Well, they come in a few different places. Firstly, the biggest challenge is shooting as close to a perfect white background as you possibly can. The closer you get, the easier it will be to tweak in Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever editor you use. And that's just the first challenge. Shooting a white background photograph in the studio, it requires a lot of attention to detail. And there are many ways that you can mess it up, or I can mess it up, I should say. You won't, I do. Before we get into the actual setup, it's important to realize that even if you're very meticulous about the photography part, and you get backgrounds that look very, very white, and you think that you've nailed it according to the back of your camera or your laptop if you're tethering, which I recommend you do. Very often, by the time the photograph gets into Lightroom, you'll notice that there has been some change in the whiteness of the background. And that's a complicated explanation. There are things that go on between the taking of the picture and the importing into your editing program. But before we get into the editing part, we need to first take a good photograph, and we need to figure out how to overcome the various challenges we're going to face. Now, be aware that the setup that I'm going to show you and how I shoot white background photographs may be different from somebody else, and that's fine. This is the way I have developed my setup over the years. It works a high percentage of the time. I can rely on it, and it's not that hard to put together. But bear in mind, there are other opinions on how to do this. So I think the easiest way to explain the pitfalls and show you how it's done is to go over the macro cage. So let's do that now. I have stripped everything out of the cage that would get in the way or confuse matters. So this is just the standard macro cage, 2 foot by 2 foot. I'm using a Nikon crop frame camera D7500 with an 85mm macro lens. Again, just to make it easier to make my points with a larger field of view than we would get if we were using some other type of lens or objective. But what I'm going to show you will work the same no matter what kind of lens system you're using. So we have a specimen set up. A little beetle. It's a year old. It's been in alcohol for a year, so it's probably feeling pretty good by now, I would imagine. And it's already set up and positioned at the minimum focusing distance. So what would your first inclination be if you were going to shoot a white background? Well, if you were going to shoot a blue background, it would probably be to put a blue background behind the subject and shoot away. And that certainly is one viable option. So if we take a white background, this is just some compressed foam. I like it because it is actually white. And we would position it in our cage like so, and then take a picture. Now, you'll immediately see that when we take a picture with a white background this far behind our lights, it's getting light, but it is not white. It's not even close to white. So you might think, well, why don't we just move the background closer and get it almost on top of the subject so that we're getting the same amount of light? Notice that this distance and this distance are about equal. So that means the amount of light that's falling on our background is 1/4 of the amount of light that is hitting our subject. Inverse square law. So if we move our background right up on top of the subject, if I can find my remote, move it even closer. And what you can see there is, yes, the background is whiter in some parts in the middle, but it quickly drops off into gray, and you also now have introduced shadows. So neither of those approaches are going to work for a pure white background with a well-defined, high contrast image in the center. So we have to come up with a better solution. Now, I'll cut to the chase on this. What we need to do is we need to set up a background that is independently lit and perfectly exposed. That way, when we take our photograph, we have a properly exposed subject and a properly exposed backdrop. And that is where all the tricky stuff happens, is balancing those two lights. So one of the first things that might occur to you would be to use a semi-opaque background. For example, this is a sheet of acrylic that's frosted. It's actually it's a bit shinier than I like. And then we could light this from the back, say with a speed light. Yes, we can light this nicely, and we can get a pretty white background. But you'll also notice that we get hot spots, and that is the next challenge we have to overcome. You can't have a hot spot because that means your background is not uniform. Not only do we want a background that is absolutely white, but it has to be absolutely uniform and white. So you're probably thinking, well, why don't we just put a softbox on the light behind the acrylic and use a studio light and even a bare bulb and spread all of that light out? Yes, you absolutely could do that, but you are still going to end up with a hot spot where the flash tube is behind the screen. So directly illuminating a partly translucent background is not going to get it either. We need something far, far softer. Now, I've told you before that there's nothing softer than a bare bulb studio light, which just essentially gives off a ball of light in all directions. So while a bare bulb would give you a large, soft ball of light, it would still have a hot spot. But there's another problem with it. That light, unless we flagged off the whole room, would also bounce off the ceiling down into the light cage, and it would affect my lighting of my subject. And that is one of the cardinal rules of doing this. The lighting you use on your backdrop cannot have any effect on your specimen. And, by the way, the lighting we're using on our specimen cannot have any effect on the background. We need to separate the lights completely. So what is the solution to this conundrum? Well, it is to take a large white surface, either a wall, if you happen to have one close to where your macro cage is set up, or a large white piece of foam board. It doesn't really matter. It just needs to be large and it needs to be white. Now, as you can see here, I have set up a sheet of foam board about maybe 4 feet from the back of the macro cage. And off to one side, I have an Einstein 640 watt-second studio flash with a very simple cone attachment on the front, which basically means it's going to direct that ball of light in a fairly wide spread directly onto the backdrop. Now, what that does is it eliminates the hot spot and it directs the light forward towards our specimen. And it is much, much closer to what we need. Now, this technique of bouncing the backlight back towards the camera covers a lot of what needs to be accomplished. So with the studio light on, we take another picture. Now I have completely independent lighting of my specimen because not a single photon from these two flashes is going to make it back to that screen back there. And likewise, the amount of light that's coming back shouldn't affect the exposure of the front of our insect. That's good. That's what we want. But this technique introduces a new problem. We have to use quite a high power on this flash in order to get light at the intensity we need for our background. And in doing so, we're throwing a very large wall of light at our specimen. So with all of the light coming in from all directions off our distant reflector card, what happens is we have light that is coming from various different angles. And what this has a tendency to do, once you get the background bright enough to give you a pure white background, it tends to cook the fine details on the surface of the insect or the flower or whatever you're photographing. Particularly if you have delicate little foot structures, antennas, and hairs especially. will get fried using this method. You can turn the power way down and that effect goes away, but to get the power where you want it, that introduces a new set of problems. You'll have a beautiful uniform white background, but you will lose contrast around the edge of your subject. And that's where the secret sauce comes in. The thing that allows us to get both the brightness and the uniformity without throwing a lot of extraneous light onto our subject. And all that is a flag made of foam board. Now, this, you don't have to make one as fancy as this. By fancy, I mean with a hole cut out. You need a hole, but you could just use two pieces of black card. I have one of these cut for all of my different setups. So if I'm using an objective, for example, the hole I have is very much smaller. This hole is cut to exactly match the frame of the image. If you're going to use this technique of using one black board with a window cut in it, which is, I think, the best way to do it, once you cut the hole, you have to get rid of the white edges of the foam inside the board. So you need to either take a little bit of black paint, or what I use is a black marker, one of the broad tip markers, and I just blacken the inside of the hole so we don't get any reflections. That's all that's about. So once this flag is in place, that's everything that we need. Now, having said that, if your back panel has texture on it that is showing through in your photograph, then what you might want to do is add a layer of diffusion behind the flag. Just a piece of tracing paper will do it. I'll sometimes use a piece of acrylic, sometimes not, it depends. But really, this is about all you're going to need once you get your power right. Which leads us to the next question of how do we set our power so that we get the maximum brightness we can from the background, but not enough brightness to fry the edges of our specimen. And that's the hard part, really. Let me interrupt myself here to say, if you don't have a studio light, you could use 2 speed lights on softboxes. The reason you need 2, and they would come from different angles, you'd want them at 45-degree angles on either side of the panel. And the reason for that is that otherwise you will end up with a hot spot, because speed lights have a very small surface of light, and that will show up as a bright spot on your background. And they also drop off very quickly. So having 2 of them that meet in the center will usually overcome that. So you can do this with speed lights, but you need 2. Somebody is going to want to know, can you do this with continuous light? Well, you can. The principles are the same, but you need some really significantly powerful background lights because of the distance that we're dealing with. And it's a lot harder to set up. This is one of the reasons I almost exclusively use flash in my macro, is it makes stuff like this so much easier. Now, there are 3 tools that we can use to get the exposure correct. By exposure correct, I mean to get this exposure correct and to get this exposure correct. The first tool is trial and error, is to set it up with some setting on your studio flash and start shooting pictures and see what we get. That's the way we all start out doing it. It involves taking a lot of test shots and lots of back and forth with messing with the lights. There are some much better ways to do it, which I'll show you now. I've removed the flag just so that there's a little bit more room to work in. But imagine, if you will, that it's still sitting there. Your lighting for the subject can be done first and completely without regard to the background. Because if we do this right, neither the background nor the foreground lighting is going to affect the other. And that's so important. So spend the same amount of time and effort that you normally would to set up your lights perfectly for your given subject. In this case, I'm using two very low power speed lights. I think one is 1/128th power and the other is 1/64th power. Both of them with a layer of diffusion inside the softbox and the softbox. So this is a fairly shiny beetle, and it does pick up reflections of light panels. So we've got to be very careful with that. So I have two complementary lights that are positioned, one from the front and above, as you can see, and one from below from the right to get the tail end of the beetle lit and the limbs on this side. I also used, when I was taking my test shots earlier, this is just a bendy arm from my quad hands. I've discovered these things are much more useful if you take them off that big yellow metal base. And I had this little reflector card positioned about like so to light the head. So do whatever it is you need to do. You already know how to light your subject. So do that as if there was not going to be a background involved. I'm going to put that out of the way for now. I love these bendy arms. So other than trial and error, there are two tried and tested ways to balance the light of your foreground and the light of your background pretty accurately, and at least get you very close in the ballpark. The first is to use the histogram and your light meter in the camera. So let's talk first about how to use the histogram. Once my flag is in place and the background is all set up, I'll take a test shot. Now, here is how to use the histogram. If you magnify the image on your camera with an icon, you just press the zoom button several times. You should have an overlay of a small box that shows you how zoomed in you are. What you need to do is once you take your test shot, you need to use that little bounding box, and using your multi-point controller on the back of the camera, put that little box right on the back of your insect or on the head or whatever part you're interested in, and confirm that with the background lit, you still have a perfect histogram when you're focused on the insect. And here's where the magic happens. Then just take your bounding box and move it off onto the background, which should be pretty pure white at this point. Use the histogram and look at the numbers that the camera gives you. It will tell you how close to white you are. But more importantly than that, it will tell you how close to clipping you are, because the trick here is to get right up against the right side of the histogram, but not over it. The second method for checking that you've got this right, and it's the one I like because it's by far the quickest, is to use a light meter. If you're lucky enough to have a very basic bog standard light meter. This is an old Flashmaster L358 from Sekonic. It's really easy to use and it does a great job. All you have to do is turn your backlight off, position your light meter when it's set to, well, it's got to be turned on. That's a pro tip. So I'm going to put it to measure the flash. I've got it set at 250. That's 1/250th of a second. That's the sync speed of my camera. That's important. So what the light meter is going to do is it's going to tell me what f-stop I need to be using with the lights at this intensity. And then all I do is, once it's ready to go, position it right where might be better there. And I get a reading of f9. Now, as it happens, I am at f8, which is pretty close. That's a nice piece of confirmation to have. Once you've done that, The next thing you have to do is, and I normally pull the luma sphere back into the housing, position my meter here, and take another photograph. Now the meter is only measuring the light that's bouncing back off the background, passing through the hole in the flag and hitting the back of the insect. And here's the key. You need to adjust the lighting on your reflector panel in the back until you are getting the same reading or less from the back of the insect. Well, from the other side of the insect. So if you're getting f8 here, you want f8 or a little bit less here. The reason for that is because if you overexpose pretty much any more than that, it'll put you in the territory where you'll start clipping the highlights and you'll fry up the fine detail around the insect. And that's the big no-no, because you can't recover that. That's why we need to stay below the clipping threshold so that we don't lose detail that we can't get back. And that's key. And when you're checking your photograph using the onboard histogram, you'll be able to see as you pass from the insect to the background, look at a few hairs along the way, and that'll tell you almost as much as the light meter. If they are well lit, they're not frazzled, you haven't lost any contrast at the edges, you're probably on the right track. So from a technical standpoint, that's all there is to it. My workflow is I don't even mess with the background at first. I get my specimen ready, I get it mounted, I get it set up the way I want it. Then I bring in my key light, get that the way I want it. Then I add my fill light and any reflectors that I'm going to use, all the usual stuff we talk about, until I'm completely happy with the test images and I'm completely happy with the histogram I'm getting from the foreground shots. Then I place my panel first, position the light, and make sure that the light really is at 45-degree angles. And you can actually just test fire and you'll see where the ball shows up on your bounce card. If the ball isn't in the center of the bounce card and you've got everything properly lined up, you're going to end up with a drop off as you go across the frame. So it's really important to make sure that you're positioning the backlight accurately. Then I'll put the flag in place with or without a layer of diffusion. Remember, if you use a layer of diffusion, it is going to cut a stop or so out of your backlighting, and you have to compensate for that with your studio light. The further back you move your panel, obviously, the more power you have to pump to your studio light to get the balance right. So let's get back to testing this. The reason I pull the lumisphere out when I'm here is my light's coming from two different directions. I want to catch all of it. Let's do that again because I've forgotten what it said. Oh, turn it on. Have I mentioned that? Pro tip number 2, turn it on again. All right. Okay, so I'm getting F8. Let me put the flag in place so that I'm not grabbing light that I don't need to measure. All right, that comes out at F2. Normally when I set this up, that panel is much closer to the back of my cage, but I put it too far back because I didn't have room with all of this video gear. But it doesn't matter, we can still use it. I just need to add a ton of power. Not a problem. 6.3, so we're getting there. If you don't have a light meter, you don't need anything fancy. You don't need the ones you look through or anything like that. For macro, having one of these handy really makes a difference with this kind of photography where balancing two light sources is really difficult without it. Let's do that one more time. I increased it. F8. Pro tip number 3, turn it off again so your batteries don't run out. This uses the most ridiculously expensive batteries. That's the one thing I don't like about them. They could have surely just put some AA's in there. All right, I digress. That's all there is to it. Once you do that, and I'll use the light meter to set the light, then I will take a test shot and I'll use the histogram to make sure that I have a beautiful specimen histogram, move the cursor to the background and make sure I have a pure white background. Then, and only then, I stack my shots. In this case, I already ran that stack. It's a fairly short stack. I had 150 micron spacing and just took, I think, 28 images. So we followed all the steps. Our images look fantastic on the camera. The light meter readings were perfect and our histograms look great. But trust me, when you get the images into Lightroom, they're going to need a little bit of tweaking. So let me show you how to do that now. So here we are in Lightroom, and this is the stacked image of our little red beetle. And the background might look to you like it's pretty white, and it is, but I would call this whitish. As I move the cursor around the background, you can see on the histogram that my reading is 95.9, 96.7, 99.6. It's pretty close to pure white down here, but over on this side it's not. So obviously my light was not completely centered. And our goal now is to take the histogram and move this broad white peak further to the right until we're getting readings of 100 all over. Believe me, a reading of 95.9 like we have at this spot right here will make a huge difference against a pure white background. It would result in a sharp edge where the background goes from whitish to white. So what we need to do is increase the whiteness of the background, and that is as easy as using the slider, the whites slider. You don't have to do anything else. Drag this to the right and you can see it compresses the histogram right up against the right edge. Now if we come back onto the image and check, we're almost there, 99, 99.5. This will probably be 100 now. So the left side looks fine. The trick now is to increase the whiteness slider up to, but not beyond the point that it impacts any of the edge detail. We can't lose any contrast or burn out any of our detail. That still looks good. Now we're getting 100, 100, 100 all over. So now as we're getting 100% all the way around here, we know that the color of this is pure white. It's going to be 255 across the board. And this will be ideal for using on a white page or on a white screen if you were looking for something seamless. So that's all there is to it. When your subject is dark, as soon as your subject starts to get lighter, we have a whole set of different problems. So that is the simplest fix you're going to be able to get away with, is just boosting the whites until the entire background is white, but you haven't lost any contrast at the edges. Let's say that we had made this adjustment with the white slider and we still had an area of gray. Let's say my background light was way off center and we had a part of the background that just is not well illuminated. How do we get rid of an even darker area without burning out our detail? We know that we can't go any higher with the white slider because when we do, we start to lose detail in the hairs. We lose contrast. So we have to back that off to as high as we can get it without seeing any loss of contrast, which I think was somewhere around there. What we need to do now, if we end up still having an area that's darker on the background, is just select the adjustment brush, and with everything set to 0, take your sliders for the whites and the shadows, for that matter, the highlights and exposure. You don't want to do anything with the contrast, but if you move all of these sliders over to the right and then just paint onto your area that's still looking dark, you will overexpose this entire area, but only this area. It won't affect the rest of the image, and the backdrop is pure white elsewhere. So when you're done, you will have removed that residual dark area and maintained the full whiteness everywhere else in the image. As you can see, oh, we've got a little bit of 99.5, and you can do that again. You can just click on a new adjustment brush, and I'll move the blacks as well. Leave the settings the same, and then just paint over that area that was still not pure white. When you're done, hit done and go back and check it. Now we're at 100. So now we've removed any slightly darkened area, and now we have a pure white background. So in 99% of the cases where your insect is dark and has dark appendages and a dark body, you're going to be able to get away with using one of these two techniques in Lightroom. But what if our subject is light colored? If the subject is light and we try messing with the white slider, we're going to impact our image as well as the background. So let's take a look at an example of that. In this second example, we have a much lighter colored subject. Not only is the subject got plenty of white, especially the pedipalps up here, but the hairs along the limbs, a lot of them are white too. And we have a background that is clearly not white. Now, to give you an example of what a white-ish background looks like when you stick it on a magazine page or onto a white background on a sharing platform, this is what you get. This is the background we have on this shot right now, and this is white. You can see there's a dramatic difference, and this is what we want to avoid. So our challenge now is to make our background white without overexposing the white parts of our subject. And that's a little bit more complicated than just doing it in Lightroom. If we went into the develop module in Lightroom and we just took the white slider and slid it up, yes, we could get an almost pure white background, but we have cooked all of the white parts of our spider. So that's obviously not going to be any good. So what we'll do instead is put that back where it was, and we'll take this image over into Photoshop and try something different. So here we are in Photoshop, and you can see just by looking at this thing that it's not white. If you want to know how not white it is, click on the Properties panel. You can find that under Window Properties if it's not in your toolbar already. And if you click on the Info tab, this will give you the RGB readings wherever your pointer is. And you can see wherever I put it, the numbers are maxing out around 220 something. So this is a long way from being white. So what we're going to do is a couple of step process. I first learned this from one of Aaron Nace's articles on his website, Flern, and I'll put a link in the show notes. That guy's a genius, and he knows more about Photoshop than I ever will. What I'm going to do is make a copy of my background by hitting Command J. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create an adjustment layer using the hue and saturation. Just click on that. And then take your saturation slider and slide it all the way to the left. Make it a black and white image. Now what we want to do is go to the mask on this hue saturation panel that pops up automatically. If you hit B for your brush and you make sure that your setting is foreground color is black, which you can get by hitting X. If it's not black, it'll switch them around. Then if you take a paintbrush, we'll take a soft brush, maybe about 20% should be fine, and 200 pixels is big enough. And what we can do is, at 100% opacity and flow, we can paint the color back onto our spider. But anyway, take your time, go over the whole image, just like so. You can see how if you missed a little part on a black and white spider, it probably wouldn't be that big a deal. For colored things, you got to be pretty meticulous about this. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now already we have a much more impressive white background. Let's see, let's check the info. It's still not completely white, so we have more work to do. Let's create a new layer on top of this hue saturation layer. And what we're going to do here is paint in some white. And then we're going to use a couple of blending tricks to smooth everything out. So with the new layer selected, hit B for brush. Make sure that white is your foreground color. And I'm going to use a larger soft brush. And now what we do is just paint in white. Now, it doesn't have to be exact, but I would say this: make sure you hit your edges. That is the most important part, because if you don't hit your edges, then there will be a demarcation. If you try to place this on a white background, you'll see a line where the not quite white butts up against the white. Now, I've missed a lot of parts there. That doesn't matter. We're going to deal with that using the blend if tool. I think I got all the way around the edges. All right, excellent. Now, if you double click on that layer, it'll open up this tool. This is the blend if tool. Now, what we want to do with this tool is tell the program that as long as the underlying layer is above a certain point of darkness, then it'll allow this white we just painted to blend in. So what that will do is bring back the edges of our subject while leaving the white intact. But if we just try to do it with the slider alone, it's a very blunt tool. And it's going to create large changes, and we don't have much control over it. But if you Alt or Option click on the slider, it'll allow it to separate into two, and you can use this finer control slider. And the idea now is to pull this slider up to the right to the point that all of your hairs are visible. That looks about right. Good. When you get there, click OK. Now the trick to this is you can probably still see a halo of darkness around there. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over this again. So create another new layer. Take your white brush exactly as you did before. Use the arrow keys to make it a little bit bigger if you desire. And do the same thing. Create another layer. Now you see that I'm overlapping a little bit, but we're going to use blend if to bring that back in. I'm staying away from the main part of our spider. I don't want to go that overboard. Okay, so with that layer done, we once again double click on it. Do the same thing, split the slider by hitting the Alt or Option key, and then drag the right half of it to the right, all the time watching our appendages for the color and the detail to come back. That's looking pretty good. There is a point when you've gone too far, when you start to see the black or the darker version of white. So that tells you you've gone too far. The trick here is to balance, just like we did in taking the photograph, is to balance the amount of white we blend in without removing color. That's pretty good, but you can still see a darker area in here. So I think what I'm going to do is do it one more time, make one more layer. You know what I didn't do on that layer was cover this right hand side. I just realized. So I'm going to take a big brush and quickly add more white to that. I saw that by looking at my layer mask. I didn't get enough white down. All right, good. It's looking better, but I still don't like the darkness up close to the spider. So what I'm going to do, like I said, is create a new layer. Once again, take a soft white brush, and this time I'll be more careful and make sure that the edges, whatever else you do, make sure your edges are painted. Now, what I'm going to do is slightly decrease the opacity of this brush to about 40% or thereabouts, and paint a little bit of white in here. Now remember, we're going to use the sliders to try to pull the detail in the actual spider back. Okay, I think that's, well, there's a bit here. I think that's good now. So let's double click on that again, do exactly the same thing, split the slider for the underlying layer by hitting Alt or Option, and then sliding the right half of the slider across the image until the colored details of the spider return, but the gray mess doesn't. If you look in this area here, you can see exactly where that happens. If I go this far, you see the gray comes back. If I keep it a little bit lower down, the gray disappears, but I have all of my appendages are now well lit. Okay, I'm really happy with that. So let's close that off, and let's open the property panel again, and let's see how our color's doing. 255. 255 everywhere. Okay, so this is a pure white background that blends almost seamlessly into our spider without removing any of the detail. And the way we got to this was by one at a time blending, and you can do this as many times as you need to make sure that you've got rid of all of the non-white that you need to. But remember, the real key is to get it at the edges. Whatever else you do, make sure they're pure white. But we have pretty much pure white all the way up to the hairs of our spider. And you can do the very hardest subjects with the white hairs and white details using this technique if you're patient and if you're willing to go back and do it again and again and again if you need to. All right, so I am going to flatten that image and save it back into Lightroom, and we are done. Those are the three methods that I use to correct the white background to pure white when it doesn't come out of the camera that way. And believe me, it never does. So having these techniques in your bag is really, really helpful. Now, this is how my lighting system is actually set up when I'm doing this shot. I've moved the cage back into its normal position. And as you can see, the backdrop is much closer. The studio light is closer to the backdrop, and the whole thing is closer to the back of the cage. It's not that important because you can change the intensity of the light, but it does take up less room that way. Well, that's all I have for you today. If you have any questions about what I've just gone over, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Leave a comment or send an email to the website and I will get back to you. If you found this helpful and you're not already subscribed, please consider becoming a subscriber. And when you do, ring the bell. Just ring the bell, whatever that means. Everybody says it, so I'm saying it. Ring the bell. And I don't know what's coming up next. I do know that it's going to be absolutely spectacular, whatever it is. This is positive self-talk. Stay safe, be well, and I'll see you guys back in just a few days. Farewell.